Good morning, everyone. My name is Vanlee, and thank you, Ross, for introducing me. As Ross mentioned, I've been in a child protection team for the last 5 years now, qualified 4 years ago. And as part of today's talk, I wanted to take you through my dissertation that I conducted about 2 years ago. It was a piece of research primarily conducted for myself about my practice and what I wanted to improve in the approach that I was taking with parents when it came to having challenging conversations, something that is very much part and parcel of our daily social work practice. Um, and so I hope, while some of these things that I offer, could be tentative, I hope that you will be able to take away some things for yourself, things that you might find useful in your own practice. I mean, within this topic, and as you've probably seen about the way this was advertised, I do touch on attachment, particularly what the attachment lens can offer when it comes to thinking about challenging conversations. But I do want to, put out a disclaimer that, of course, it is tentative. I'm by no means qualified to diagnose any kinds of attachment patterns, and don't seek to do that in this presentation. So, none of what I say is really prescriptive, but hopefully does encourage some thought around, having challenging conversations in a better way. So my research began by really looking at what it was I wanted to amend in my practice. What I was finding was standing as a barrier in the relationships that I was trying to build with the families that I'm working with. And that was particularly around conflict. When conflict would arise in conversations, that was where I found that there were barriers arising in my relationships. And it was particularly with families and most families who come into the service during really uncertain times in their lives. A crisis point that can be quite difficult to talk about in conversation. And I was drawn to a particular example for me that came up in my practice when I was having a conversation with a mum about some of the concerning lack of changes that we had seen in the safety for her child. And immediately when this sort of challenge was raised in our conversation, it it changed the way that this parent was feeling, that there was a clear level of anxiety, their body language had changed. But what I was most intrigued about was how I had responded to that, to this rise in conflict. For me, rather unhelpfully, I started to continue outlining my concerns and wondered, what's happening? Why is the anxiety level still being raised? And it created a rather unhelpful dynamic in our relationship that unfortunately did have a lasting impact on how all of our conversations had taken place from then. Um, and, in a wider sense, when thinking about challenging conversations, I spoke to lots of different colleagues, and everyone seemed to have a different way of how they like to approach challenging conversations or conflict that arose. But from what I had done, it didn't really align with how I wanted to be seen and to practice as a social worker that was helpful and collaborative. And so I really wanted to understand where this anxiety was coming from during those challenging conversations, with the hopes of finding strategies to better manage that, and to kind of invite conversations that were moving in the right direction. And how we can align that, our approach with our intent to be helpful and supportive of the families that we work with. So I delved into the research, around challenging situations in social work, and immediately the first studies that I'd found really, or the first evidence of challenge that I found was really locating that challenge as being sourced from parents. That parents were the source of the challenges that we faced in our conversations. And from the studies that I'd found, there was almost a feedback loop that I noticed was being creative. For example, in this one study of 14 women, there was a feedback loop between, there was a fear that they of a judgment from those social workers that caused them to become defensive. And this almost reinforced the social workers' ideas about them being challenging or resistant. And because it immediately points to the source of parents being a challenge, I thought that was really important for me to understand what exactly was I classifying as challenging in these conversations, and to understand how other social workers were also perceiving challenge when it came up in social work. And so I looked particularly around literature, and around the literature around challenge and conflict in conversations in social work contexts. And often this idea of conflict and challenge was being conflated with terms like resistance, involuntary, non-engaging. And to me, when we think about the time that we're entering families' lives as being particularly challenging for them, it's easy to see why this might, encourage a resistance or a defensiveness, and that these challenges might arise. But for me to look at this, and how challenge was being used in literature really allowed me to differentiate between whether that resistance and challenge was coming from the person or whether it was something that was arising in our relationship. Now, in taking responsibility for my practice and how I was coming across to families, I chose to focus on the latter and really had to reconceptualize how I was understanding challenge and conflict that was arising in conversation, so that I could focus on improving that and working towards creating an environment where that challenge could be withstood, and the relationship can withstand that challenge. And so I delved into further research, and as it took me, it really focused me on emotions as being one of the main things that come up during challenging conversations. And we can see how it has a very sort of practical, whether it's unconscious or unconscious impact on the way that we respond. Now, there's different ways that emotions have been seen in research. On the one hand, there's some research that says actually it's not helpful because it blocks our ability to think about our practice. It blocks our ability to reflect on how we are having a conversation with our family. Whereas on the other hand, I found research that actually emotions, and these emotions particularly that arise during challenging conversations, can be sources of revelatory moments for ourselves and for the families that we work with. Removing or eliminating that in any form. I mean, we could say, it'd be really helpful if I didn't feel anxious or worried about having this conversation, but removing that entirely didn't seem helpful either, as it almost creates a sort of distance, or that's what research says, it creates a distance between us and the family that can be rather unhelpful. And so there was a few different ways that I could go about, thinking about emotions, but particularly what came up for me and the way that I wanted to understand how it was playing in my practice was how this idea of fear, in this little diagram here, functioned in my relationship and with challenge and conflict. And so I could almost see that there was like a feedback loop starting up with a fear of confrontation, leading to me delaying sharing my concerns and a general avoidance of those worries, which then increased the concerns, and the distrust that parents felt in our relationship because they hadn't known that this is something that I was worried about, and thus increasing the likelihood of confrontation. And then feeding back into my fear of that again. And so it was clear that there was somewhere that I needed to intervene, to manage those feelings that were coming up for me and how those were arising in my conversations with families. And so this is where attachment came in. And it's particularly intriguing that actually all of that research brought me to attachment, because challenge and confrontation comes up a lot in attachment theory research. And attachment theory, if you might not know, it originated from a theorist named Bowlby, who theorized that the relationship between a child and their caregiver forms an important basis for how safe and secure they are to develop and explore their environment, and theorized that there were four different types of styles that we could attach to our caregivers, and that being secure, insecure, avoidant, insecure, anxious, and disorganized. And the key parts of that attachment theory is that it suggests that yet it is something that may continue as we move into adulthood. So it may inform how we form relationships as adults and the levels of anxiety and avoidance that we experience in those relationships. Now, Bowlby goes so far as to describe the relationship between a therapist specifically and their client as a attachment relationship, and because it has a similar tenets of us, with the intentions of trying to create a safe environment for challenge, for development, for those conversations to arise. And conflict is one of those things that can be particularly triggering for our attachment patterns, particularly if our earliest experiences of any kind of conflicts and challenge have been adverse. And there's a few reasons why it does this. It places stress on the relationship and creates a tension that tests both of our abilities to manage the emotional reactions that arise, to manage our behavior. And ultimately, any kind of challenge threatens to undermine the safety that we've created in those relationships. For me, I noticed that the avoidance, that it was more so an avoidance and anxiety that was arising during these challenging conversations. And there is a word for this about how it manifests in our relationships with families, and it's called transference. It's where our previous experiences and relationships can manifest on our current relationships. And it was something for me to keep in mind that actually, sort of a light bulb moment is maybe it was me that was bringing that anxiety and that challenge to those conversations, and that's why it was arising. So the attachment lens really helped me hone in on the interconnected nature of our experiences of trust, safety, and comfort, which are all things that come under threat during challenging and conflict-based situations. And while, attachment styles we now understand are not entirely prescriptive, they have the ability to change. It allowed me to consider how challenge can produce that almost biological response of fight or flight, but that this can work both ways for me and for the parent that I'm working with. And so as part of my research, I actually conducted my own adult attachment interview to help me understand a little bit more about what I was bringing to that dynamic and how that was affecting the family's ability to cope with conflict and challenge that arose in our conversation. Better yet, it also gave me a path towards to think about actually how can I work towards creating a more secure attachment with the families that I work with. From the research that I've shown here, there has been some evidence, interestingly, about how attachment and particularly a practitioner's attachment can play a role in their working alliances, in their relationships with families, and that actually therapists that were able to show the tenets of a secure attachment, that is, that they had a safety in their conversations, that there wasn't a fear of being judged or disengaged from the conversation when anxieties were to arise, actually help produce a more positive experience for families, particularly if they themselves had anxieties or avoidance when it came to challenge. So, having conducted all of this research, I wanted to think about what I could do to change. And for me, it was about moving away from this avoidant and anxious stance during conflict. And like I say, towards a position where I could be a secure base for families and form a secure attachment with the families that I worked with. An attachment that really had the capacity to withstand challenge and any kind of conflicts that were to arise. And it started off with looking at relationship-centered practice, which is really the belief and the concerted effort on enhancing the relationship that I had with families from the outset. And what this also involved is fostering the notion of epistemic trust, which is the kind of trust that a person may have in the authenticity of what we're sharing. So, for example, for a parent to believe that what I'm sharing with them is going to be helpful and what they're sharing with me is going to be helpful to us. Um, And that very lastly, that mentalizing was a key part of that. Now, mentalizing is the ability for us to represent what another person is feeling in our own minds. And there were two types of mentalizing that were really key, especially considering how emotionally involved some of these conversations can be. The first part being mentalizing for myself. And that is through continuously reflecting on how a conversation was impacting me emotionally and the impact that that was having on the conversation that I was having with the parent. And that's what reflexivity is. And then there was another type of mentalizing that, the research suggests could be useful, and that is mentalizing for the other person, but in a way that we weren't taking on some of the emotions that they were feeling. So being able to recognize the anger, the hurt that they might be expressing without that affecting us. And that's a strategy called imagine other perspective taking, which still allows us to mentalize, but in doing so, we're keeping ourselves safe. We're allowing us to stay in a mode where we are curious and open to those ideas. And that's particularly because what research has shown us is during high points of emotional intensity, our ability to mentalize can actually be lowered. So that ability to be curious, that ability to be open to new ideas actually shuts down. And so all of these strategies were telling me that there was a way that I first needed to manage the emotional intensity that was arising during these conversations, while also building a relationship that could withstand that emotional intensity. And so coming on to what might be the most useful parts for everyone is the practical stuff that really worked for me. And I've really narrowed these down into what came up in my conversations during my research and what was being fed back to me about what parents found helpful. And so, from undertaking my research, warming the context, beginning conversations with warm invitations were crucial from the outset to creating that safe environment and that safe context. And this, for me, this was through asking questions like, what would be the right way to start our conversation? If I was curious about something, how could I raise that with you? Um, where were you before you came to this conversation? Because what that allowed me to understand is the context that parents were entering this challenging conversation from. And also, it allowed me to assess actually whether this was the right time to even have a challenging conversation. The next thing that I needed to really be mindful of is the language that I was using when it came to talking about emotions, particularly because some things can be lost in translation. So it was really important for me to have a level of understanding and for there to be an understanding about what, for example, anger meant, how anger was described, what it represented for that person. And it really allowed me to appropriately capture in my mind what that parent was experiencing, and in a way also helps us build that trust. Perhaps because I was curious about what that parent was experiencing, perhaps that helped us build a level of trust in our relationship. The next thing that I came across, in the later stages of my research, was using silences, using particularly creative silences. And that is silence that is used at poignant points of our conversation. And for me, that was using silence when emotions were shared. Because if I was looking at my practice pattern, it was particularly when big and challenging emotions were rising that I was shutting down, that I was closing off those conversations. And so by being silent when a particularly important or a really big emotion was being shared, added gravity to that. And what it did was actually slow the pace of the conversation down. So that emotional intensity was also reduced. And our conversations could continue to be challenging in that they were about really, really important topics without them affecting the conflict that was arising. And we were able to continue a conversation about that without it becoming overwhelming for myself and for that parent. The next thing that I found particularly helpful in reducing that emotional intensity is collaborating in our goals from the outset. So reflecting my understanding of what we would both like to achieve from these conversations, because it allowed us, even when challenging conversations were to arise, to come back to that being our common ground, and that being a place that we could come to that was safe for the both of us. The next thing, and I feel like this is possibly one of the most important points for me, is to be mindful of my emotional posture. So how I was feeling before and after the conversation. And one of the techniques that I had used was journaling. So this was journaling before and after conversation to really break down points where I'd noticed an avoidance or a barrier in our conversations. But then also the technique of grounding, which is when during a conversation, you really connect with your internal body experiences to recognize that actually this conversation is causing me a bit of anxiety and I can feel myself shutting down. So how can I manage that so that we can continue to have this conversation? And then very lastly, what I had found is that parents really appreciated when I shared with them what was going on in my own mind. So we're not continuously trying to imagine what's happening in the conversation, but we're sharing that. And what it kind of did, it sort of had a sort of two-pronged approach. It demystified for them what might have been some uncertainties about how I was viewing them, but then also allowed me to check in whether actually my understanding was what they were actually sharing, and was correct. So coming to the end of my presentation, what are the things that I still carry on in my practice? For me, it has been really, really revelatory to understand my own attachment pattern and how that plays out during challenging conversations, because it's allowed me to understand that my avoidance could arise at any time, but now I have strategies to manage that. And perhaps, it might be useful for other practitioners to hone on the things that trigger their own attachment responses, to think about how this might be barriers to our thinking and responding during conversations with our families. The next thing was I learned the importance of building a safe context for families before these challenging conversations can take place. And a helpful way to do this, it could be through reducing the emotional intensity of the conversation, but through also strengthening the relationship as we go on. And then very lastly, I completely changed my perception of emotions, which I'm very happy to share, as something that we cannot completely mitigate. To mitigate them, we lose the value that it brings to our interactions. So even when our conversations are the most challenging, I found that those emotions could be a real vehicle for change, and that we can work on managing those emotions, we can work on coping with them, but they provide an invaluable resource to us building that understanding and relationship, especially when there are challenging conversations. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this helpful, and I'm open to any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Vanlee. That was really, really interesting. I know just from my own personal perspective as supporting participants is that I think it's a really common theme that I see in terms of some of the anxiety and worry about having challenging, difficult, emotional conversations. So thank you so much for sharing your research. I think it was really insightful. Colin has put a question which I'll ask. He's kind of wanting to get an illustration of what you refer to as creative silence. I don't know if you're able to just elaborate a little bit more on that, just so we could, get some more helpful discussions.
Yes, of course. I mean, particularly what the reason why creative silence came up is because I was looking at silence, using silence in our practice as a whole. Using it creatively is what the research, or the strategies particularly outlined is using it during poignant moments. So really being intentional about when we're using silences, not just as a way to create space, but also to add gravity, to when we notice that something might have been really particularly difficult for a parent to share, being able to use that to really focus in on those conversations. conversations. I could give an example of it happening in my research. It was when a parent had shared with me that they had the feeling of misunderstanding, that they felt misunderstood. And that was the first time that this parent had ever shared that feeling of vulnerability. And for me, it was almost like, I really want to respond to that, but I chose to hold on to that moment of silence. And from that silence, sort of emerged that actually this was a really important moment for that dad. And we were able to use that going forward, that feeling of misunderstanding. It helped me understand how important it was for that family. And so to be creative is to really use those moments sparingly. It can be a bit awkward, if someone shared something really important with you and you stay silent a lot of the time. So it's really about choosing your moments when it comes to silence. But in doing that, it can actually add a lot of gravity to what was being discussed.
Yeah, thanks, Vandy. I think it's about being very deliberate, isn't it, in terms of how you're approaching that communication and seeing silence as a really effective means of communication, as opposed to feeling that you need to fill that space with your own thoughts and feelings. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about. There's another question which relates to, it's from Lily, and it just kind of asks about does it tie in with other techniques that you might have come across in the frontline program, such as motivational interviewing? Do you think that they conflict or complement each other? Any thoughts on that?
I think that's a really good point. I think a lot of systemic principles do overlap with each other. They complement each other at different times. But what I've really found through doing this research is it's important that it works for you. So, motivational interviewing has some really, really great techniques about, gauging where the person is in their journey of change, being able to reflect or understanding. These are all very, very similar principles, but it really depends on what's going to be helpful in the conversation, really. I think it works brilliantly alongside some of these techniques. But, one of the main things that I explored, through speaking with my colleagues, even during this research, is that it wasn't so much about the systemic principles I was using, but how it was functioning in that conversation. And if it works, it works. But, I didn't go into this thinking, okay, I'm going to be specifically with a motivational interviewing hat, and I'm going to use only those techniques. It was helpful to use a bunch because that's what worked for me. But I don't see a reason why actually it couldn't work really well with some of these techniques.
So it sounds like that in the moment, you're kind of acutely aware and trying to adjust your approach depending on the situation. So you're not like fixed and rigid to one way of being, but you're more kind of, I suppose we refer that to being relationally reflexive, that ability to adjust in the moment. And we've got lots of questions coming through actually, so we might not have enough time to get them all the way through. But there's a question which is from Geraldo actually, which relates to emotions and what you said about being a good vehicle to change. The question, I suppose, is suggests around what emotion or emotions do you think is the biggest motivator for a change? It's quite a tricky question, but
That is quite a tricky question. It's hard to say at the end of the day. I think it depends on the family that you're working with, and it depends, sort of going back to what emotions mean, especially if we're talking about thinking about across languages. Emotions have different meanings for different people, and so what's going to inspire them towards change will really be dependent on what is that they want to change in their lives. But I'm not an expert when it comes to those emotions, but I really think, any kind of emotions, especially if it's something that's particularly poignant, could be used as that vehicle, but it's really dependent on the conversation that you're having.
yeah, thanks, Vanny. I think for me, it's about firstly recognizing those emotions, isn't it? And then exploring them maybe with the person that you're talking to so that they can be the experts into what's the most effective thing to help them change, maybe. So I think, as you
Definitely.
talked about, it's not about kind of ignoring the emotions or, it's about how do we work really kind of creatively and curiously. around them. But no, thank you so much. We haven't got time, unfortunately, for any more questions, but so we'll work out a way with Vanlee to try and get a response to some of your questions. So I just want to thank you again, Vanlee. Really interesting topic, and you can see from the questions that it's really touched a lot of our kind of people that are watching this. So thank you so much.